but I have had some rocky
Some
connections.
mishaps.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're live.
We're live? Hello,
Oh
everybody.
no, we're live.
Oh no, barely, yeah.
Hey,
We've
everyone.
just been struggling.
This is Christopher Paolini, and the one and only... This is your cue to introduce yourself.
Oh, the one and only. This is Stefan Bachmann and the one and only Christopher Paolini. Thank you guys for being here. Oh my goodness, I see people in the sidebar. How exciting.
Yes, we've been having some interesting technical issues with the internet here, so if one or both of us drops out, do not be afraid. We will log back in, rejoin you, and we will have a wonderful conversation.
That's the plan. Yeah, I really hope it doesn't happen again. Yeah, thank you for being here, Christopher. I'm so excited to be introducing my new book today. It just came out. Christopher's new book came out in September.
Yeah.
It's this massive, massive brick, and this is my book, and it's about a fourth of the size.
Show us yours. Show us yours.
This is Cinders and Sparrows. This came out today. I'm very excited.
That is a gorgeous cover.
I love it. Yeah, it's very kind of pearlescent. I think it's my favorite cover of mine that I have so far. I really like it. And yeah, it's kind of a gothic fantasy. It's my attempt at writing a story with all of the elements that I love most in it, which is haunted houses and ghosts and monsters and just all the things I would have loved to read as a kid. I think that's always my goal when writing books, is to just like make sure I would have liked it as a kid and that I think I'm doing fine. Yeah. Yeah, I'm super excited that it's... Say what?
I said very cool.
Yeah, I'm excited that it's out. It's been 4 years since my last book came out. And I wrote a book in between that was very, very, very long. It was 150,000 words, which for me is really long. Maybe that's... Christopher told me before that To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is 308,000 words. Which, yeah, my books are much, much smaller. But this book I wrote in between was also really long. And that's why it took kind of so long for Cinders and Sparrows to come out, because I had to write that in between book and then decide that it wasn't working and write something else instead. Yeah, that was unfortunate.
I want to talk about that some more, because that's an interesting and painful experience, no doubt, as an author. But first, big shout out to Barbara's Bookstore for hosting this event. Wonderful store, and they have copies of Cinders and Sparrows for anyone who's interested in, which you ought to be interested in if you're watching this.
Wow,
so
thanks.
Definitely check that out.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara's Bookstore, for hosting this. It's really cool to be here. I don't think I've ever done a crowdcast before, actually. Christopher's told me he's been doing them all month, which is a relief for me, because I feel like, okay, good. Someone knows what they're doing. But yeah, thank you guys for being here, and thank you, Barbara's Bookstore, for hosting.
So tell us a little bit about Cinders and Sparrows. So so I have to apologize to you. We were talking about this a little bit prior to the event. I haven't had a chance to read the book because it just came out. And of course, we've both been very busy, but I want to read it. But again, I'm not familiar with it at the moment. So tell us, what is the book about? Okay,
so Cinders and Sparrows is about a housemaid who kind of believes that she's going to be a housemaid forever, that she's resigned herself to a life of drudgery and toil. And one day, in the manner of every good fairy tale, there's a turning point, and she realizes, no, she's actually very special. And a scarecrow climbs over the garden wall and delivers her a letter telling her that she is the last surviving heir of a family of witches. And so she sets off to a distant castle, and all is not well in that castle. And she quickly figures out that she is in big trouble, and that it's not actually maybe in your best interest to be the heir to a family of witches. It can be pretty dangerous. Yeah, that's kind of the gist. And again, it's kind I really loved Edgar Allan Poe and Daphne du Maurier and all those kind of books with very strong spooky vibes when I was a kid. And I was just I've always wanted to write a kind of a haunted house story, or in this case, a haunted castle story. And fun fact, speaking of castles, you guys can't see it, but right outside my window is a castle. My house is just below a castle. The joys of living in Europe. So I've always loved castles. I've loved big rambling houses. And I've also loved kind of the subgenre of books that are set in magical houses. I feel like we've all read them. I don't know. There's a new book that just came out called Piranesi, set in a magical house. And I just love those kind of like stories in a domestic setting, but the domestic setting is made weird and like mysterious by magic or by the vastness of it, or that's pretty much my favorite thing. So Cinders and Sparrows is set in a huge haunted castle.
So perhaps I'm mistaken, but it almost feels like you had some of that same interest in A Drop of Night, because it was this
definitely
almost like an underground palace that was really pretty crazy.
That's I did notice that literally every single one of my books has like a rambling house in it, a huge, weird, amorphous house.
So have you read, or are you familiar with the Gormenghast novels?
I have. I think you actually told me to read those way back when. I remember, I feel like you recommended it.
I might have.
Gormenghast. I read the first one. And yeah, I did love it because that's what it's about. It's about a big, strange house. And that's another thing, like in A Drop of Night and in Gormenghast and also in this one, it's like a huge kind of a city under one roof. And I love that idea. The idea of just like all different classes, all different types of people, all different types of rooms, all under one roof. I just find that such a fascinating concept. And yeah, every single one of my books has that in it. So I wonder if my next book will also have like do you feel like your books also have something in every single one of them that you're conscious of doing?
Absolutely.
I feel like, yeah.
What
is it for you?
Well, I ask this question of authors all the time of, do you find that there's a certain story element that you continually return to again and again over the course of your work, like some private obsession that just means something deeply to you? And everyone gives a different answer. And every author I know has an answer. That's the really cool thing.
What is yours?
When I was working up To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, I ended up when the book was finished, I look back on it, I go, boy, there's some interesting similarities to Aragon I didn't realize when I was plotting it out. But I'd say my answer would be personal transformation. The moment, the transcendent moment of the story where the character transforms physically and emotionally in a way that hadn't been possible previously, and that because they do transform, it allows them to overcome whatever obstacle they're dealing with. That for some reason appeals to me quite deeply. So I seem to return to it again and again.
So a really strong turning point in the character. That's
exactly.
Is there a physical element, like a physical thing, like a motive that you return to a lot, though, would you say?
It's hard to say because To Sleep is only my second complete story I've ever published. So
I don't know. I read 4 before it. 4 big old novels.
But they were one story.
Okay. All right.
I don't know. Physical motif, maybe travel, maybe exploring the universe around us.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah.
How about for you?
I feel like I have several. I feel like all of my books have some kind of house in it. I feel like they're all about connected to that. They're also all about home in some way, like finding your home. Where do you belong in this world? I think that's definitely the main theme of all of my books. I don't know how that's connected to the house, the huge house thing, but I'm sure there's some kind of link there. And then a lot of my books also have, or a lot of my 4 books also have an element of just like possession of some sort. Like there's often like an evil character who is taken over by some outside force. So I have no idea where that comes from, but I definitely noticed those things. And this Cinders and Sparrows has that also. So I don't know, that's just like, maybe every single one of my books is going to be about possession and finding your home, but that would be interesting to know why that is.
So did you have a specific inspiration for your new book, or was it just sort of an amalgamation of other stuff that it grew out of, or was it one specific key thing that got you thinking about this story?
I think this story definitely came from a feeling of someone who is coming from nothing, kind of assuming that she is going to be alone in the world, and the idea of then traveling somewhere and finding that there's a place that's always kind of been there, that's been waiting for you. Just the feeling of, I think the first scene that came to me was when she was traveling by train, and she was passing all of these people who were getting out and going to their homes and their bright, cheery lamps and, waiting families. And just the idea of her just watching that happen and waiting for her to come to her own destination. That was kind of, I think, the first scene that arrived for me. And that is what the book is about. It's about finding your home. So I do think it grew out of that. And then obviously all the trappings, all the ghosts and the monsters and stuff, that's cool. I love that. But I feel like a book is never about that, That's why I always think it's weird when people are like, oh, you write fantasy, that means it's this kind of book. But like, fantasy is just the trappings, it's just like the skin of the novel. But it's never really what a book is about. And so, yeah, those things I love, and I wouldn't have written the book without them. But the core of it was that scene of her looking for home.
Would you say that fantasy allows you to make metaphors literal in a way that is not possible in other genres?
I think so, but I also think it's a way of doing something, of making metaphors that just you can just expand. There's so much more space, I think, in fantasy to explore ideas. Maybe you have so many more options in your toolkit, I think, to illustrate something. So which I guess is exactly what you're saying. Yeah, I think it's a great way to just show truths from life, but it's a more interesting way to do it, And I think probably every fantasy author gets asked a lot. I don't know if you've ever been asked this, but I definitely have been asked, like, are you ever going to write non-fantasy? Like, when are you going to grow up and stop writing fantasy? But I really think it's just another way to show life, and to me personally, it's a more exciting way to write about things that everybody deals with,
Yeah, and besides, I mean, all of our oldest fiction is fantasy.
Definitely,
The Epic of Gilgamesh is fantasy. The Odyssey, the Iliad are fantasy. Beowulf is fantasy. I mean, it's myths and legends are fantasy.
Definitely, but also modern novels, serious literature, that's also fantasy. What's the people think maybe the difference is that this could happen in real life, but fiction, and it's all just someone's point of view. It's all in somebody's head, So I think it's negligible whether it could happen in real life or not. I don't know. I never really thought that was a compelling reason not to write fantasy, whether it could, whether it could happen to you. Yeah, maybe not right exactly like that, but that's not really the point of it. Yeah.
By the way, if anyone wants to ask questions of us directly, there is a button at the bottom of the screen that says ask a question, and that would be the best place to post your questions.
And, wow, things are happening on the sidebar.
And then we will skim through, because then you can upvote or downvote the questions in the question section, which is extremely helpful. So we'll get to the questions later on in the conversation. Cool. So something that occurred to me, and this is kind of like, this is going to take a couple of steps to get to the question I actually want to ask. So the first step is, before we started this event, we were talking about the fact that the last video event we did was back in, I want to say 2012, wasn't it? And we were doing this extremely choppy video interview. And that is when, 2012 is when your first novel, The Peculiar, came out.
There it is.
And this one's signed, folks, by the author. Signed by the author. That's the cool bit. And
the cool bit is that on the back cover is a Christopher Paolini blurb, and I still remember being
right there,
absolutely thrilled. Oh my goodness.
There on the back.
The memories I have of getting that. You guys have to understand that my mom bought me my first Christopher Paolini book when I was like 9, so I've been a fan for a really, really long time. And so just the surreality of knowing that Christopher Paolini had read my first book, it just like blew my mind. So that's the really cool bit about that.
Well, and I had a similar experience with Aragon, because in the first edition from Random House, the quote that was on the back was from Anne McCaffrey, and I grew up reading Anne McCaffrey. So
yeah, it's so strange. Cool. No, it's so weird to think of.
So strange. So this leads to the next step in the question, building toward the question, or maybe this is the question, which is, I know that you were quite young when The Peculiar came out. You were what, 19? I want to say.
Yeah, 19.
Yeah. And now you're old and grizzled. Well, I'm the grizzled one, but you're heading towards grizzled.
I'm getting there. Pre-grizzled, yeah.
In fact, you're almost as old as I was when we had that interview.
Really?
Yeah. Getting close.
Okay, yeah, that was 8 years ago. Yeah,
getting close, like another 2 years or so. So I guess my question for you is, since you, like me, started as a young author, and you have been doing this for a number of years now, and Cinders and Sparrows is now your fourth published book, or fourth published book.
Fourth, yeah.
Is this something you plan on continuing for the rest of your life? Is it something you enjoy as a hobby, more on the side? I'm just kind of curious what role writing and publishing holds in your life now compared with when you started, and how you see it progressing into the future.
Yeah, well, I didn't study writing. I didn't start out wanting to make writing a career. I studied music, classical music and theory, and that's what I got my degrees in. So writing kind of happened by the wayside, and then it grew into something that I was not anticipating at all. And it kind of barged music out of the scene a little bit, which, much to the chagrin of my professors at the time, because actually A Drop of Night, which Christopher mentioned before, I was writing that during uni. And one of the reasons it's such a like dark and bitter book is because I was very dark and bitter at the time, because I was so stressed out about trying to choose between music and writing, because you can't really devote, or at least I can't, maybe some people who can, but I don't think you can really devote enough time to one thing, to two things, to excel at both of them to the level that you may want to, And so I guess after uni, I kind of decided I really wanted to get better at writing, and I wanted to focus on writing. But I think writing is such a broad field, so I don't really know where that's going to take me, that focus. I really hope that maybe I can expand beyond books. There are so many different forms of writing that I'm interested in, but I would love to be in some form a storyteller for as long as people are willing to listen to my stories. Yeah. But it was a kind of a difficult thing for a while to choose, like, what is the importance of it for me? Because for the longest time, it wasn't going to be a thing, it was just something that I really liked doing. But in my head, my path had always been to become a musician. And then eventually that just like changed. So I don't know, going forward, I hope I can continue to be a writer like that. I would say that's my goal, definitely.
Very cool.
Have you ever felt you wanted to move away from writing?
On occasion, when some of the editing has showed up, I've certainly questioned what I'm doing with my life.
Haven't we all? Yeah.
That's actually not true. That's facetious, because when the editing shows up, you're pretty close to the end of the book. You're into the home stretch as far as the work goes. For me, it's been the years in between where I've been working very hard at writing, and I am a fairly fast writer when everything is in place. The trick is getting everything in place in the first place. And so with a book as long as To Sleep, it just takes time. And I got off on the wrong foot. You were talking. I'm curious about that manuscript you had to walk away from, because I wrote the first draft of To Sleep, and it was almost 300,000 words long, and it did not work.
Oh,
and
no.
so the book is divided into sections, and everything after the first quarter of the second section of the book ended up being written from scratch, basically.
Wow.
All the way to the end. So if you read the book, all those events, all the places the characters go, everything that happens, none of that was in the original version of the book. And it was one of those things of, do I walk away from the project or do I try to fix it? And it was incredibly painful to do that. So,
but you considered walking away, though.
More than once, especially after the inheritance cycle. It was like, well, I've done that part of my life. Do I want to do something new? And like you, I enjoy storytelling just too much to completely give it up.
I mean, I don't think I'll ever stop. Maybe I'll just write stories to like my dog or something, but I think it'll never like stop. But to go back to the idea of like walking away from a project, actually the Peculiar came into being because I walked away from the thing that I was working on before. And I guess it was less dramatic because I was like 16, so it wasn't like a huge step. But I do remember consciously thinking like, okay, I have this manuscript and I don't like it that much. So either I keep working on it and try to make it into what I want it to be, or I start this new shiny idea, which became the Peculiar. So sometimes it can be great to leave it behind, but it depends on the manuscript. And with the manuscript that I left behind to write Cinders and Sparrows, I'm still really, really fond of it. And I really, really want it to turn into something that people can read, because it's a very like elaborate kind of Baroque fantasy with, people from the moon and kind of this Renaissance city and magic. And I don't know, I really love it. And the problem is there's just like too much of it. I think there's too many ideas, there's too many characters, there's too many like fancy scenes where everything is described until, just too much. And I'm still figuring out how to like snip it down to a size where it feels like a story and not just like this weird like sculpture.
No, that's the wrong approach. The right approach is to add another 100,000 words and dilute all of that so that it feels like a proper story.
Okay, I'm going to tell my editor that. I'm sure she would be thrilled to hear it. Because I think, I mean, she did say that, it needed some trimming. And I guess that's my instinct. I don't know if your instinct is different. But I always think like if something's not working, I just have to delete more. Because I don't know, I guess writers are different in that regard, but I tend to overwrite and then have to cut it back. I don't know if you're the same.
I usually drop 10 to 15% during editing minimum, but I had a very strange experience with the new book because I was really trying to avoid info dumping based off my experience with fantasy. So I was really writing it super tight, focused, which might surprise people who've read the book. And I turned it in. Thank you. But I turned it into my editor and two editors, and they had me so they had me cut stuff, but at the same time they had me add material to flesh out some things that I wasn't fully explaining. And as a result, by the end of the process, the manuscript was 30,000 words longer.
Oh, okay.
So the manuscript got longer during editing, which I've never had happen.
But I think that's also a good sign, because sometimes it just, I don't know, I think that has happened to me before. And sometimes it just means that you're like finding more, getting more out of your head and onto the paper, at least for me.
Could be. So now I was going to ask you, A Drop of Night really stuck with me because, as you mentioned, it's kind of dark and bitter, and there's an intensity to it. I actually compared it. I was on a panel, and either your editor or publicist was around. This was at a convention like 2 years ago. Someone who's familiar with your work was on the panel, someone in the publishing world. And then we were talking about A Drop of Night. I was comparing it to Alien.
Oh, okay, cool.
And she was comparing it to the Goonies. So we were coming at it from opposite ends of the spectrum. But the reason I was comparing it to Alien was because the idea of these characters that were trapped in these corridors and with the dangers pursuing them. I mean, it's an intense book, especially for being ostensibly a YA book.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is a bit schlocky, so I can see why it could be. I think I want it to be Alien, but it probably is more Goonies than Alien. I do like the book at this point. I think I've come around to being like, yeah, this is an interesting exercise, but it was definitely a struggle to write, and it took a lot of drafts and a lot of rewrites, and I'm really glad you enjoyed it, because I know that the character is very, angry. She's not someone you'd necessarily want to be friends with, which is a big talking point and why I think a lot of people are like, I wouldn't want to be friends with that character. And I always think, well, that's okay because they're a character in a book. You're just supposed to think they're interesting. You don't need to be friends with them.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, yeah, I just think it was a bit of a complicated process to get that book going. And I definitely was inspired by probably Alien and by Cube and by Resident Evil and all of these kind of, yeah, pretty dark science fiction. But yeah, I don't know what the end result was maybe.
Well,
Yeah.
I enjoyed it actually. Like I said, and that's why I'm also curious to read your new book, because I can see you testing the limits of your craft and learning stuff book to book. So
Thank you.
do you see Cinders and Sparrows, Sparrows and Cinders? I'm sorry, I'm getting titles confused here. Cinder and
Cinders
Sparrows.
and Sparrows, yeah.
Yes. Do you see it as just a standalone, or is it something you'll plan on revisiting as a duology, or just in the universe of the characters, or what have you?
It's definitely a standalone. It's a finished book, and that was also really satisfying to write a complete story and feel like, okay, this is the ending, because The Peculiar also had a cliffhanger, my first book, and that was felt like two books split in two, or one book split in two. And Cinders and Sparrows is just, it's a nice little contained box, and that felt very good to write an ending. And I think it could easily be expanded into a series. I think there's a lot more one could do with the world, but it's definitely finished. And to go back to what you said about like expanding the craft, I think A Drop of Night was kind of an outlier as far as style and content, and Cinders and Sparrows is kind of back to the old-fashioned fairy tale voice of The Peculiar and the Whatnot. So I don't think it really pushes boundaries in that regard, but I do think I learned a lot. And it felt so much breezier to write. It was really, really fun to write. So
did you find that writing modern material or more modern material helped clarify your prose style, and actually like getting away from the fantasy style for one book and then coming back to fantasy? Do you feel like it helped with that?
I think it must have, yeah. I think definitely just like paring back the poetic, language was probably a really good exercise. Um, I do love kind of like florid prose. I think it's just, I love to read it and I love to write it. But I think Cinders and Sparrows is a little bit more spare because I wrote A Drop of Night before it. So I think I just learned like when to stop a little bit. Which to me, I think is always a good thing. And the book I wrote after Cinders and Sparrows, which hopefully will be out eventually, it's fantasy, but the writing is also more spare. So probably A Drop of Night did make me kind of think about, how much atmosphere do you need? And because I always think that's so interesting too, like how many words do you need to get your feeling across? How much do you have to talk for the reader to understand what you're trying to give them? And there's so many different approaches to that, but I love the idea of like distilling it as much as possible. And one thing I thought was really interesting and cool about To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, I'm like 2 hours into the audiobook, but I love how it doesn't feel like, it feels like you're in this world, and I don't know what your approach is to make it so different, but I feel like you're able to describe things much more than I do without me being bored. And I feel like I would, if I described everything or like let things sit like that, I would, as a writer, I wouldn't know what to do. So I'm always trying to get things going like as fast as possible. And then to sleep.
Sorry.
I just felt there's so much like breathing room in it. And I think that's really interesting because when I think of my books, it's always like set piece, set piece, set piece. And it's very kind of theatrical in how the characters are moved around. And yeah, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, everything feels very just like naturalistic, you know?
It's interesting you say that because I think the answer is just how our brains process information. For me, writing those descriptions isn't a chore because I find it genuinely interesting. It's like these are the things I pay attention to in life that I'd be interested in knowing were I in this situation or were I this character. I also think it depends on how you think of a story because you mentioned the set pieces. I think of my books as one set piece, one set piece, one set piece, very much like you're describing. But the way I go about describing and showing those set pieces is in a very different style than yours. So it's like I can say this whole scene is doing X, Y, Z, and it's going to end with this incredible event. This is my set piece. But the way I go about doing that is in a way that makes sense for my brain, I suppose. You know, and the other thing I think is I think it depends. Part of this is how you think about the project when you go into it. Like if I were to write a sort of more fairy tale-esque story, more in the style that you have, man, I'd probably go about it in a very different way versus thinking about a story like an epic. You know, I went to sleep thinking this is a big sci-fi epic. It's going to be a complete story in one book. I have a lot of room to play, and it needs that room. So
yeah, definitely.
Versus,
yeah,
I had my collection of short stories last year, The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, and one of those stories is you know, like an old fairy tale almost for the Urgles, and I wrote it in a very different style than To Sleep.
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah, that's true. That's true. So maybe it's just the format that you choose for your books, you know, the versus what I do. But I think it's really cool because yeah, as a writer, I think I get bored easily. And I don't want to describe things that I don't. But I think it's so interesting too because whatever the writer is interested in, the reader is going to be interested in too. So because you're interested in what you're writing, when I'm reading it, I'm like, oh, this is so cool. But I know that if I wrote that, readers would be like, well, I don't care about that because I don't think I care about that. So I think it's just cool how you're able to kind of like transmute your enthusiasm for subjects into your writing and make it cool to the reader. Yeah.
So do you plot your stories out before you write them, or are you more of a discovery writer?
I definitely try to plot now. Probably one of the reasons why the book that is on hold now is on hold is because I didn't do an outline. So it's, yeah, it needed that. And all of my books since then, or the last two books that I wrote, had a very clear outline and like a 3-act structure, you know, roughly more or less. And I just really like to know the end before I start the book. I really like to know, and often like with Cinders and Sparrows, I wrote the ending scene right after I wrote the first chapter. And that feels really nice because you're basically just like filling in the bookends, you know, and you know exactly where everything's going. And to me, that's a big relief to have that.
I'm kind of amazed that you can write out of sequence like that. Because I think for me, trying to write the final scene right after writing the first scene would be, my brain doesn't like that because it's like I need to live through the story with my character in order to be in the mindset the character would be at that final scene.
Yeah, but I think that's also because your books are so much bigger than mine. It's probably harder to like jump to the end. But I think this book is quite compact, and it's a very like, I'm like, okay, she starts here and she's going to end here, and I kind of can feel what the journey is going to be. And I'm sure I couldn't do it if it were like 800 pages long. I would definitely also become confused. But I think with this book, it felt very clear. I knew like the path she was going to take, and I liked having that in the back of my mind, just knowing, okay, this is what she's going to feel like at the end, and how is she going to get there.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that you've become more of a plotter over the years, because I've heard that from a number of authors, but I've never heard the opposite. I've never heard anyone say, oh yeah, I used to outline everything and now I don't do that anymore. it seems to always go the other direction.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's ever like stopped plotting. I think maybe it's just, when you have no pressure and you're just like starting out, you don't need an outline as much because you don't, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it was like that for Aragon, but I know for The Peculiar, it felt very like instinctual. It was just like, oh, I kind of feel like I know where the story is going and I know everything, and things just kind of fell into place very naturally. And I don't think that happens that often after debuts, because then you start getting serious about stuff.
It did not happen for Aragon. I had to outline that sucker and the inheritance cycle.
Okay.
And then with To Sleep, I tried writing without a massively detailed outline, and that's what got me in trouble. So
Okay.
my brain does not like it. So do you want to try answering some of these questions here?
Yeah, let's see what they are.
So let's top rated one here is, will there be dragons?
Will there be dragons in Cinders and Sparrows? There are actually, yeah, that's a cool question because there is a dragon in Cinders and Sparrows. It's a kind of an unconventional dragon. I think that's all I'm going to say about that. It's part of the house, let's say. But yeah, there is a dragon in Cinders and Sparrows.
Well, I definitely have to read it now. So, so we have a question here from Evie R, who's saying, would you read to us a bit of Cinders and Sparrows?
Ooh, yeah. I can do that. I don't know. Maybe I'll just read the very beginning. Chapter 1. It was the first day of autumn when I came to Blackbird Castle, the trees copper and green, pumpkins growing along the ditch by the side of the road, a moon like a lidded silver eye already visible in the evening sky. In short, an excellent day for a witch to return to her ancestral home. But of course I knew nothing of witches then. My mind was on simpler things, the spring that had wormed its way through the velvet of the coach bench and was poking me in the back, the fact that I was cold and stiff, and also the fact that we had just stopped with a jolt in the middle of the road. The coachman thrust his red-cheeked face through the window. "That's that, miss," he growled. "That's all the farther I'll take you." I blinked at him. Then I clambered out of the coach, dragging my carpet bag with me. We were on a desolate mountainside, forests to my left, a precipice to my right, a river rumbling somewhere far below. "Blackbird Castle?" I asked. "Where is it?" "Not far," the coachman said, pointing up the mountain. "If you can fly." My gaze followed his wizened finger, my heart sinking. There was a path, stitched with bridges, wending to and fro among the cliffs and forested slopes. And far, far back, its towers barely poking over the crowns of the great old trees, were the spires of a house. A few glowing lights pierced the gloom like watchful eyes. "I don't suppose there's any way to get the carriage up there?" I asked, as politely as I could. "I paid for the full journey." "You didn't pay me near enough to take you right up to a blackbird's front door," the coachman said, and spat onto the ground. His great inky horses were pawing and snorting, their breath steaming in the chilly air. "Not for all the gold in Westwall. What's a girl like you doing going up there anyway?" His gaze darkened. "You're not one of them, are you?" "No," I said, but what I meant was, I hope to be, very soon. The coachman peered at me more closely, his eyes glinting like a pair of coins under the wide brim of his hat. "I trust you know the rumors about their old witch queen, how she ate the hearts of her enemies for dinner, boiled on a bed of greens, how they've all got pairs of silver scissors hanging from their belts, and no one knows what for. And listen to this. Betsy Guilford once told me she crept up to a window and saw them dancing around a circle of chalk on the drawing room floor, and all the spiders in the room were dancing with them." I squinted suspiciously at the coachman. "That sounds highly unlikely." He snorted, but he looked confused. I suppose he had expected me to be frightened. "All I'm telling you," he said, "is you better watch yourself. Odd things happen in these hills." That's the beginning.
Very nice. Very nice.
Before she gets there. And odd things do happen in those hills.
I would expect nothing less. Here's a great question from Patricia. She says, so many of your works, Stefan, include multiple disciplines or compositions with the novels. What comes first for you in the creative process? Character, map, music, plot, or does it vary with each work? That's a great question.
Oh, that's a cool question. Thank you. I think it's always the story, and the story is always a feeling more like than an actual, piece of work prose. So it's usually some kind of a feeling that then I try to put into words, which is what I think all books are. It's just a way to try to package a really nebulous concept into something that you can hand on to people. And so I think that's always what it is. It's always like an inkling, some kind of something that I want to turn into words. And then music, I love doing music. There's music for Cinders and Sparrows. And I just love the idea of finding little themes and little bits of music and things that go along with certain scenes. And that's more just like a fun extra thing that I like to do. I don't feel like it's an integral part of my creative process. But
do you record the music as well as composing it?
I do, yeah. But a lot of it's digital orchestra. It's just like, you just have to like look for the right sounding instruments out of the sound libraries, and then you have to mix it and try to make it sound like a real orchestra. But it's fun though. I love doing it. It's a really nice like addition to the writing part.
Nice.
But yeah, definitely words come first and then music comes later, maybe.
Now I forget, do you draw your own maps?
I don't know, but actually Cinders and Sparrows has a really cool floor plan, which was a fun project to do, because when I was a kid, I loved floor plans and I loved like looking at just old books full of floor plans. And so for this book, I wanted to make a floor plan of Blackbird Castle. So it's the equivalent of like a fantasy map, but since the book takes place in like a confined area, that's the map. So I guess there is a map, but I drew a rough sketch, and then my mom, who is a very, very skilled artist, made it actually cool and like look, viewable. So you can see that on my website. But I would like to be able to draw maps, and I would like to be a better like visual artist, but I've never done that. No. You do draw, no? I think I've seen stuff on Instagram, and just the eye on the front of Aragon, is that did you do that one? Yeah.
And actually for To Sleep, we have 7 pieces of art in the book, and I did 3 of them, I want to say, and the rest were my assistant Manuela. So
yeah,
I think the US edition is a little different because we have these amazing fractal end papers.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I don't have that in mine. I think I have like the paperback.
But yeah, there is art in the book. There's 7 maps in there. You can see visual art's a lot of fun, and but just like with all things, it's time and energy. So the time I have put into my drawing is what you've put into your music, and honestly, you've probably put more into your music than I even have into my art. And the art for me is frustrating because it's like I love it, I could do it, but to be as good as I want with it, I would have to put as much time into the art as I do into the writing, and the books won't happen.
Yeah, that's the thing. But you also just see it as like an addition to what you do, just like as a nice like counterpoint.
It's extremely useful, and just like with your music, could add something quite a bit to the experience of your books and building out the world of your stories. The art is very similar. I'm actually working with some concept artists to pull together some art for To Sleep, and what I've been able to do is I can do early preliminary sketches. It's rough stuff, but I can show them what I want, and then they can build off of it. And if I couldn't do those sketches, trying to describe art is like trying to describe music. It's very difficult.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's like trying to describe a book. That's why it's always so hard when people are like, "What's your book about?" I'm like, "It's all in the book. You just have to read the book."
Right. That's right. It'll take me 876 pages to summarize the book.
I did describe it. Yeah.
So that's a great question here in the chat. Does Switzerland inspire the story or scenery, or are there other locations that inspire you?
Oh, okay. So for anyone who doesn't know, I was born in Colorado, but I grew up in Switzerland, in Zurich. And I think that Switzerland is definitely an inspiring place to live. Maybe not so much in regards to like the, well, I don't know, but the landscape is very inspiring. I love the mountains, and now I live in a German town called Cleves, which is right by the Netherlands, and everything is very flat. So that's kind of sad. I always miss the mountains.
And what brought you to that part of Germany? Was it family, work?
No, I had friends here. I used to live in Berlin, and then at some point I got kind of tired of Berlin because it's kind of an odd place to live, and so I wanted to move to like a smaller area and just try a new place. And I do like it. I love living so close to the Netherlands, but yeah, there are no mountains, and that is something that I really liked about Switzerland, and just like the beautiful nature that's there. I think that definitely informed my writing, but weirdly enough, I don't think like the culture has informed my writing very much. I think all of my books have a kind of an English fairy tale vibe to them. And I think Swiss folklore is very different. So it's not really informed by that so much. Because I think I'm definitely more like inspired by the books that I read more than just like where I was. And I read a lot of English folklore. And I haven't honestly read very much Swiss literature, except maybe Heidi, which is not a very good comp for my books.
How many languages do you speak or read?
I speak German and English, and I speak a tiny bit of French. But the thing about German is that Swiss people speak a very different kind of German than High German. So have you been to Zurich, or Christopher?
No, I have never actually been to Switzerland.
Oh, wow. They should invite you to sleep in a sea of stars. Then you would hear how odd they sound when they speak German. Because if you understand High German, you won't understand Swiss German. But if you understand Swiss German, you will understand High German. So it's kind of like, yeah, I do speak those two and English. And then like,
how does Austrian German compare?
I would say Austrian German is like halfway between Swiss German and High German. So it's a little bit more slurred than High German, but not as slurred as Swiss German. You've heard Austrian German?
I have. I've had some very intense Austrian collectors chasing after me at conventions.
Oh, really? Okay. Frightening. Yeah, it's a different language, but I think Austrian is closer to High German. Yeah, and then French I barely speak, so.
So we have a question here from Cassidy, who would like to know what your next book is going to be about. And I know you mentioned you do have another book. Do you know when it's going to be published? Any sort of timing with that?
I don't know when it's going to be published, but it's with my editor now, and I very much hope she likes it. Because I really love it. It was really fun to write again. It's kind of I don't want to say very much about it, but it's YA, and it's, yeah, I loved it. I hope that it does get published in the future. So I don't know, fingers crossed that my editor likes it too.
That's always nerve-wracking, waiting for the editorial letter.
Yeah.
So Patricia is asking, what would each of you say is something you haven't yet tackled in your writing that you would like to pursue?
Ooh.
That's another great question.
That is a great question. I would really, sometimes I think that as much as I love fantasy, I would like to see if I could write a story without fantastical elements, just as like a challenge. Because when I left the military, I thought, oh, I have all this cool material. And then I wanted to like write about it. And I tried to like marry it with fantastical elements. And it didn't really work. So I was like, well, I really wish I could write about these things in like, and still like in a way that intrigues me as a writer. And so at some point I would really like to just write something that has no horror elements, no fantasy elements, and just see if I can do that. and maybe also something for an adult audience. You know, all of my books are for kids and YA, which is great. I definitely don't think there should be any kind of I don't think those books are lesser in any way, but I do think it would be interesting to write for adults at some point, which I actually wanted to ask you about. Do you think it's really different pivot, like, because Aragon was marketed as a young adult book now? Was it different for you to move to adult?
I mean, it was different because I ended up with a different publisher for this book because it is adult. But I mean, I did the best job I could in writing the Inheritance Cycle, and I never tried to think. I never thought of it as YA. It was just I was writing the best fantasy story I could at the time.
Okay.
So same thing with To Sleep. It's like this was this was what the story needed to be. It was not a story about an adolescent. It was not a story about a child. So it's an adult novel. Now there are definitely differences, but sorry, I feel like I'm about to sneeze. We have smoke here from wildfires in California that have blown up to Montana, so it gets to me a little bit. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, my answer is very similar to yours. I would love to write some stuff without sci-fi fantasy in it, just to show I can. I'd love to write a thriller. I'd love to write some romance. I'd love to write some historical fiction. I love good stories. I love reading them. I love watching them. I would love to just do more. And with To Sleep, I kind of feel like I got my big epic sci-fi out of my blood, and now I've done my big epic fantasy, I've done my big epic sci-fi, and now that kind of frees me up to do things that are different now.
Yeah. Are you going to tell us what you're going to do next?
Well, I just finished a short sequel novella to Sleep in a Sea of Stars, and I'm currently working on revising a short prequel novel that I wrote back in 2013, and it wasn't quite working. And but the revisions are going well, so that should be done in a couple of months. And I just finished up a short story set in the Fractal Verse, which I don't think I've told this to anyone. No, I haven't. So no one tell anyone about this, but it was actually by request from Ferrari.
Wow.
They were looking for a short story for their end of year, like glossy coffee table book. They asked a number of people, and they wanted a story from me. So I did a story for Ferrari. I don't know if they're going to use it. I don't know if they're going to like it, but I kind of.
That is so cool. That is something that probably almost no author can claim on their resume.
I was going to say no, but then it was exactly that thought. It's like, who gets to write a story for Ferrari?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's cool.
And my Italian grandfather, who's no longer around, would have smacked me upside the head if I had said no to that offer.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are all things. And I have to write the screenplay for the movie adaptation of To Sleep.
Oh yeah, the movie news. It's going to be a movie.
Yeah.
That's cool.
You should get a Drop of Night should get made as a movie. You know, like an R-rated YA film that'll terrify everyone.
Yeah, well, call me Hollywood. I will sell it to you. Go for it. I think it's cool to think about, books being turned into movies. I never think it's like a priority just because I think they're so different. And I feel like you could talk a long time about the differences between books and movies. But I always think it's a bit sad when authors talk about their books being made into movies as if that's like the highest form. But I think it's just like it's like a different form. But books are, just as good as movies. And usually if a book gets turned into a movie, it's hard to really translate your imagination to and then the audience is often like, oh, that's not how I wanted it. And it's like, well, that's because it's someone else's vision of what you read. So I don't know.
So we're starting to approach the end of the hour here. Is there anything we haven't talked about with Cinders and Sparrows that you'd like to?
Not really. I really hope you guys like the book. I'm really proud of how it turned out. I think it's a really kind of a cozy Halloween sort of read. I love that it's kind of, I don't know, it feels like a very warm book to me, even though it's about ghosts and spooky things. But when I think of the book and the writing process of it, it feels very just like nice. And some of my previous books don't feel like that. They're kind of dark or scary. And Cinders and Sparrows, I feel like I like the balance of like dark and light in it, and I'm really pleased with how that turned out. So yeah, I hope you guys like it. And thank you guys so much for being here and for listening to us chat about our books, and also read To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, because it's really, really good. And the audiobook is also really, really good. I'm listening to it right now, and the speaker is just so like good at her job. It's really great.
Yeah, that's Jennifer Hale, who did. She's actually has the Guinness World Record for being the most prolific voice actress in the world, and she has been the voice of Cinderella for Disney since the '90s. She was Carmen Sandiego, the voice of Galadriel in the Lord of the Rings games, Halo. She was the female lead in the Mass Effect games.
Yeah. Did you choose her?
I did. I met her at a convention back in 2012, and I thought she'd be good for this book. So I chased her down, and she said yes.
Awesome. Well, she did a great job.
Yeah. So now someone was asking, is there any place that they can get signed copies of your book?
I don't think so, because of the pandemic. I think it's a bit hard to do that. In the future, I know that there is going to be something, but I can't really say why because of reasons, which sounds really vague, but there might be in the future. But right now, there's no way to get signed copies, unfortunately, because I'm not in the US. But
in the meantime, you can get books from Barbara's Bookstore, which has been so wonderful as to host this event. And you can get Stefan's books, and you can get mine, and help support a local independent bookstore, because they help support us and make it possible for us to write all of these stories.
Yes, please do. And thank you, Barbara's Bookstore, for having us.
Indeed. Let's see. Do we have time for one more question, you think?
Yeah, do we have another question?
Yeah, I think so. Books that feature art at the beginning of each chapter adds a lot. Arabian Nights, Chronicles of Narnia, Harry Potter all featured little drawings. Would you feature more artwork in your future books?
Yes, I would love to. I love illustrated books, and I love just like the more material in a book, and the more, I love books with footnotes and spot art, and just, I love like books with a lot in them. So I would love at some point to do it like an illustrated book, or I also just love like visual art. So I think it would be really cool at some point to do a book with a properly illustrated story. So yeah, absolutely. That's definitely on my bucket list.
I like the sound of that. Well, that was a great question. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stefan, for having me on board for this.
Thank you, Christopher. Thanks a bunch. And thank you, everyone, for being here.
And I can't wait to read Cinders and Sparrows.
Thank you. It will be on its way to you very, very soon.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.